Switch 2 has been out for almost a year and I finally decided to grab one along with Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza and Super Mario Wonder. The recent memory price hikes pushed me to buy one earlier than I wanted to, but since I was always going to get one, might as well do it before it becomes more expensive. The original Switch was an interesting device thanks to its hybrid nature back in 2017. The ability to play games on the go or on the TV seamlessly was a novelty that didn't wear out. For me, it was impressive to play something like Breath of the Wild with its huge open world and graphics fully intact on a handheld. I liked the system overall, and even before the Switch 2's reveal, I felt a simpler approach to the Switch 1's successor would be something I'd be more interested in, rather than an entire redesign from the ground up, as long as the performance gains were there to compensate. Since the Wii, Nintendo has intensified its ability to make each new system innovative in a major way. Some older consoles like the SNES and N64 were innovative, don't get me wrong, but it was mainly down to the graphical evolution and the games themselves using the more powerful hardware, rather than a new way to play, like with the Wii Remote as an example. With the Switch 2, however, what we have here is a really simple successor that is exactly what the name suggests. It's a next generation Switch with more powerful hardware, even going as far as having an almost identical user interface. I believe they went this route with the Switch 2 because of the failure of the Wii U and even the 3DS to some extent. While the 3DS still sold a respectable amount of units, when you compare it to its predecessor, it's night and day, while the Wii U might as well not have existed at all. This all meant lower revenues and smaller profits for the company, and while this is not as impactful for PlayStation or Xbox, that have massive conglomerates backing them, it is for Nintendo where the risks of failure is more damaging. So this is why I believe the Switch 2 is a simple successor this time around. It worked for the Super Nintendo, it worked for the PlayStation 2, and so far it's worked for the new system as it's broken a few sales records already, and it's on its way to 20 million units in its first year, which is not exactly a small feat. I'll be going over various aspects of the device from specs to UI and how the games themselves look and run on it. Starting with the specs, the main star of the show is the system on chip Nintendo has chosen. The CPU being used is the ARM Cortex A78C, which launched in 2020. It's an 8-core CPU, 2 of which are reserved for the operating system. From what I can tell, this CPU isn't going to beat today's flagship smartphones, but it is good enough to beat the Jaguar CPU used in last generation's Xbox One and PlayStation 4, by a factor of over 2 if the leaks are to be believed. What this means is it should be fine to handle ports from the last generation of consoles, but not guaranteed to handle all from the current. I wouldn't expect to see GTA 6 on the Switch 2, but there have been surprises already like Star Wars Outlaws and Indiana Jones. The GPU is based on Nvidia's Ampere architecture and has 1536 CUDA cores. In handheld mode, with the current clock speeds that we know of, this equates to around 1.72 teraflops of compute, and in docked 3.07 teraflops. The handheld figure is lower than the PS4's 1.84 teraflops, but how AMD and Nvidia calculate GPU compute is different, so it shouldn't be directly compared. I find that from upgrading my PC GPU many times, even if an Nvidia GPU has less teraflops, it will still outperform the AMD one in benchmarks regardless and other games. In other words, it's likely that handheld mode Switch 2 is still stronger than the PS4 despite the lower number, which I find pretty amazing. Gone are the days of sitting under a lit lamp so I can try to play Super Mario Land 2 on the unlit Game Boy screen. The system has 12GB of LPDDR5 RAM with a bandwidth of 68GB a second in handheld mode and 102GB a second in docked. This is still fairly high compared to your average smartphone, but doesn't quite reach the PS4's 176GB a second. Although it doesn't exactly need to either, because compression techniques to save on RAM usage and bandwidth have improved since 2013, so it shouldn't be a big problem here for the most part. Leaks have indicated that there are 9GB of RAM available to games, leaving a hefty 3GB for the operating system. I say hefty because I have no idea what could possibly be using up that much RAM considering how bare bones the OS actually is. I presume it's the game chat feature with its ability to display 5 gameplay screens simultaneously, albeit at an extremely low frame rate, or perhaps features to be introduced in later firmware updates. It's hard to tell. Whether 9GB will be an issue for developers remains to be seen. Certainly for last gen ports of games it will do the job, as the PS4 used around 5.5GB for games, while the PS5 uses around 13.5 instead. The use of DLSS on lower internal resolutions along with lower quality settings should help developers work around the Switch 2's RAM, but again, it remains to be seen. With these GPU and RAM specs in mind, it's important to note that while the Switch 2 is capable of native 4K gaming, you really shouldn't see the system as a 4K machine, and it's easy to get carried away with this perception when you look at the amount of ports being rendered at said resolution or being helped to output it using DLSS. It's more of a 1080p machine that should have superior image quality or graphics to the PS4, with some games perhaps going to 1440p or maybe 4K itself, depending on if they're old game ports or indie titles. In all, it's not the highest end SoC for a handheld they could have chosen, but it doesn't need to be. It just had to be a next gen leap compared to the Switch 1, and they've achieved that. It's a great long term strategy for the company too. Usually a console has to be around 7 to 8 times the performance of the previous iteration as a baseline in order to justify a next gen experience or spec system. But I think Sony and Microsoft will struggle to reach this baseline number as time goes on, because of the likes of transistor nodes becoming more expensive or architectural improvements becoming smaller for various reasons. Rumours already indicate that the PS6 will only be 3 times the rasterization performance of the PS5, with a focus more on ray tracing improvements instead. Nintendo will probably not have to deal with this small jump in performance until 2 generations from now, because the transistor nodes will be more mature and hopefully cheaper, giving them more flexibility and performance targets compared to Sony and Microsoft. This problem, however, will eventually catch up with them too, but by the time it does, the difference in performance of their system and the other consoles will likely be at smallest anyway, provided no major breakthrough happens with transistor shrinking. So specs aside, let's look at the system itself. The first thing I noticed out of the box was the larger size of the tablet versus the original, and it's thanks to the much larger screen, which is now at 7.9 inches compared to the 6.2 inches of the Switch 1. The Joy-Cons are also larger to accommodate the new screen, and not much has changed with them otherwise. The buttons and analog stick are a little larger, but otherwise they feel similar to the old ones, just bigger. The right Joy-Con can now be used as a mouse, and while I haven't used it much, it did feel accurate enough, so I can see the Switch 2 versions of games like Civilization being superior to the other console versions because of it. The new Joy-Cons click into place using magnets, and it's more satisfying compared to the previous sliding ones. I've read that people have had some sort of stability issues with the old Joy-Cons, whether they were loose or falling out of place. I can't say I ever had those problems, but the new one seems surprisingly sturdy. Whatever magnets are being used to hold the controllers to the tablet must be pretty strong. Since there's no sliding mechanic, it's harder to accidentally put the Joy-Cons in the wrong side. The tablet is also color coded along with the Joy-Cons themselves to prevent this, which is a nice touch. I never used the stand on the original Switch, but I can tell just from the tests for making this video that the new one is much better than the old. It can be adjusted to a wide range of angles, and thanks to the larger screen, I can see people getting more mileage out of it in this form. The tablet also has a microphone built in. I haven't tried it yet either, but from what I've seen, it is shockingly good at isolating your voice from real world noise. Presumably it's using some version of Nvidia's AI broadcast features to achieve this. The thing that struck me was, despite being noticeably larger than the Switch 1, it doesn't really feel much heavier at all, which is pretty impressive. So overall, the Switch 2 seems well built, perhaps more so than the first model Switch 1, but it remains to be seen if Joy-Con drift is still an issue, along with any other problems. But so far, it seems like that and the connectivity problems that people did have at the Switch 1 launch aren't an issue here for the new system, which is great to see. So far so good then, but unfortunately, upon booting the system up, I was greeted with problem after problem when it came to transferring my Switch 1 data over to the new console. I signed into my Nintendo Online account on the Switch 2 and tried to transfer the data, but despite the consoles being right beside each other, they couldn't make a connection to transfer the data. So I'm just going to make this section of the video for those who are having issues like I did, and maybe it'll solve your problems. On startup, you'll be asked to log into your Nintendo account, but this time don't do the data transfer option. Just log into your online account and get to the home screen of the Switch 2. Once you've done that, presuming your Switch 1 is updated and to the newest firmware, you need to turn on the Switch 1, go to the system settings for that console and then data management, where you'll see the option to transfer save data to another Switch console. Choose that and then do the same on the Switch 2. Once your saves are transferred, go to the Switch 1's virtual game card menu and deactivate whatever game you want to transfer over to the Switch 2. The caveat with this process is you will need to download the games over the internet, but to be honest, I'm not sure the local system transfer would have been all that fast anyway. Before you begin downloading, I recommend in the internet settings to disable IPv6 on the Switch 2. Doing this increased my download speed tenfold for whatever reason. You'll know whether a game is activated on whichever Switch system by the small icon being blue. On the Switch 2, go to the virtual game card menu and activate whatever Switch 1 game has now been deactivated from the old system, and it should begin automatically downloading on the new one. It's actually an okay system, it just has a stupid language that only makes sense after you've done the entire process. I should talk briefly about the UI here too. It's almost identical to the Switch 1's, with a few new additions I'll speak about later. One thing I'm glad to see improved is the eShop. It not only loads up much faster than the old one, but it performs much better too, although it can still hitch up here and there. You can now finally set up parties and chat to people on your friends list across any game, just like on the PS5 and Xbox, which is a welcome change, although the profile system is still terrible, with no way of actually directly messaging friends using text inside the UI itself to quickly get an online game going. Most of this stuff should really be standard by now, so it's really disappointing that stuff like that isn't in the system yet. Now that we've set up the system, it's time to see what it offers. I'll start with handheld mode since it's likely where most people will begin. If there's one surprising aspect of the Switch 2 hardware, it's probably the screen they chose. The original Switch used a 6.2 inch 720p 60Hz display, and it was actually quite decent with nice colour reproduction and sharpness, despite the mediocre pixels per inch. It was expected that Nintendo would use something more along the lines of a 800p screen or so for the Switch 2, so they can conserve battery and increase performance. But instead they've chose a 1080p panel with a surprising 120Hz refresh rate instead. Booting up the menu in handheld mode gives the impression of really nice colour reproduction, superior to the already decent Switch 1 display and not far off the one on my gaming monitor, which is no slouch. I'm not a display expert, but my understanding based on research is the Switch 2 colour reproduction on its display is on the higher end of the scale. Booting Mario Kart World, the game looks stunning on the display and to my surprise also looks really sharp. The pixels per inch is a good bit higher on the Switch 2 than the original despite the huge 7.9 inch display. I don't own any gaming handhelds or tablets, so it's been novel for me to be holding a handheld with such a gigantic display that has output and graphics that look this good. So it's impressive on that front then. But once things start moving, that is when the positivity turns to disappointment. You may have read reports that the Switch 2 display has issues with motion clarity and a slow response time. Moving the camera or playing a 2D game will make this issue apparent with visible blurring and pixel trailing behind various objects on screen. I can confirm this problem exists and it's fairly bad, although not unusable. The best way I can describe the screen is that there's sort of a double image happening as if you were going slightly cross-eyed on purpose. I've owned many LCD monitors, many of them very cheap, and none of them as far as I can remember looked quite as blurry in motion as this one on the Switch 2. The reason why it occurs is speculated to be from Nintendo not enabling overdrive on the screen panel, which is what pumps voltage into the display to quicken response times. Obviously doing this comes at the cost of less battery life, but from what I can tell with today's LCDs, even cheap ones, you almost have to be going out of your way to make the response times as poor as the Switch 2's. In other words, it's possible that the screen they chose for the Switch 2 is actually good, but the issue is on Nintendo's end in terms of how they're powering it. My cheap secondary Samsung display that's a decade old doesn't even have this issue, and it was entry level when it came out. This is a hybrid device, so it makes zero sense to me as to how this display has otherwise great attributes, but the one thing that actually matters to the gameplay experience is pretty bad. An update to toggle overdrive should happen in the future, with a warning to the user that it will decrease battery life. For the other half of the Switch 2 experience, I mostly played the system docked, and it's here where I was most impressed overall with the turnout. The first games I tried were backwards compatible titles. The display I'm using is an Acer Predator 27-inch 4K 144Hz gaming monitor with, as I mentioned earlier, pretty good colour reproduction. No HDR was used as this display does not support it fully. It's one of those fake HDR 400 displays. I'm going to go through some games and what I thought of them running on the system, and hopefully you can see a comparison with them running on the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, so you can see for yourself the difference. Starting with Mario Odyssey, the difference is massive compared to the Switch 1. The resolution boost is immediately noticeable, and to see a Nintendo game look this sharp is pretty exciting, and without any third-party emulation like you'd see on a computer using Dolphin Emulator or something. Unsurprisingly, the game's art also holds up perfectly fine. The draw distance has been increased too with the free update for this game, and it works seamlessly on the Switch too. You don't need to mess with any settings in the options menu. Captain Toad also sees a massive boost in its resolution, and considering the type of game it is, should make for a better gameplay experience as it helps the player to see more of the environment and how to solve the puzzles easier. Mario 3D World has another massive boost to its resolution and it looks incredible. But the difference I saw with the new Bowser's Fury exclusive to the Switch 1 edition was ridiculous. Not only has it changed in terms of resolution for the better, but the frame rate got doubled at the same time. It's a total game changer in all aspects, and no upgrade fee is either. Like Captain Toad, a multiplayer game with isometric camera really benefits from a high resolution, so it's great to see it in action here. The next game I picked was Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Once again, the higher resolution lends itself to this game's art very well, and most importantly, the frame rate issues with the game on Switch 1 have been fully resolved. But there was one issue I did notice with the depth of field. On Switch 2 it seems to have been lessened, and this is a shame because it does add to the tilt shift effect. And I've noticed that this type of issue also happens on PC games when you increase the resolution, so I'm not sure what's going on here. It's not game breaking, but it would be nice if it can be fixed, as this effect does add a lot of charm to the graphics of this game. Smash Bros. Ultimate shows no sign of improvement, and I think they're likely saving a meaningful graphical upgrade for the next game, which should be announced this year or the next. But it plays the exact same on Switch 1, maybe some frame rate drops here and there have been cleaned up with the Switch 2. Zelda Tears of the Kingdom shows no sign of resolution increase, although the frame rate is more or less locked to the 30fps target on Switch 2. That's without the upgrade pack being installed. Once I installed that, the game essentially transformed from a blurry low frame rate mess to a sharp 60fps 1440p image, which was really impressive. I didn't try Breath of the Wild, but I presume it's the same result there. I was waiting on the Switch 2 to play this game again, as I stopped playing a few hours in on the Switch 1 because of those issues I mentioned earlier, and it's been well worth the wait. Mario & Rabbids surprised me, as I always thought its frame rate was locked due to its consistency in hitting 30fps. But here we now have a locked 60fps instead, which makes a huge difference. The resolution is unchanged, which is a shame as this art style would benefit greatly from a higher res, I feel. I recommend this game in general if you like modern XCOM games or want to see what the genre has to offer for a beginner. Animal Crossing New Horizons is also untouched unless you buy the upgrade pack. The game still renders in at 1080p but with better anti-aliasing of some kind. The UI is now at 4K resolution along with faster loading times, although not fast enough for my taste, they're still a bit slow. It's an overall disappointment to be honest. I don't see why it couldn't do 1440p or 4K at 60 frames per second, now knowing what the new system is capable of. Luckily it's only €5 for the upgrade pack, so it's not a big deal. Like Smash Bros, perhaps then a new Animal Crossing isn't far off the horizon, so that they want to keep some of the upgraded graphics for that game instead. Mario Galaxy 1+2 now run at the full 4K resolution, and the result is shockingly good for a game that came out in 2007. The colours are really vibrant and the image quality is crystal clear. It's Nintendo's artists at their best. I haven't tried Galaxy 2 before, but presumably the result is the same as 1. I also never played that game before, so it's cool to have an entirely new 3D Mario to still play. It should be noted, however, that the 4K res is only available in these new versions of the games, and not the 3D All-Stars collection, so be careful on which ones you are buying. Some third-party games I own, like Red Faction Guerrilla Remastered, Burnout Paradise, the Sega Mega Drive collection, and so on, are all untouched officially. However, if a game has an unlocked frame rate, then this is also where you'll see the Switch 2's power come to fruition if a developer hasn't patched the game to support the new hardware. A clear difference can be seen with Red Faction, where its unlocked frame rate struggles to get past 40 FPS on the Switch 1, but on Switch 2 it's now locked to 60, making for a much better gameplay experience. I also recommend this game as it's fantastic. I'll go through some actual Switch 2 titles that I own. I also downloaded some demos from the eShop, as is tradition when buying a new system. Mario Kart World is an interesting one. The game was originally developed for the Switch 1 before moving to the new console, as a result of the older console not being able to handle the open world and addition of more racers on screen at the same time. At first glance it does look somewhat similar to Mario Kart 8 graphically, but taking a closer look you can see more sophisticated lighting, real-time shadows which are also utilised by the day-night cycle, as well as higher polygonal 3D models in general. You can also notice improvements to the spectator crowds too, which went from 2D animated cardboard cutouts to fully 3D rendered models. The game is a step above Mario Kart 8 for sure, but I presume it doesn't look exactly next gen in comparison because of this game's Switch 1 origins. Some of the texture work in particular doesn't look exactly great, and sometimes the world can feel empty. It looks sharp and renders in at around 1440p at 60 frames per second, with little to no drops in its performance. It's impressive looking every time I do play it, so it's not a bad showcase title at all. Donkey Kong Bonanza is another game that has its origins on the Switch 1. It seems to be using the same engine as Mario Odyssey, along with the same development team, and it definitely shows in terms of user interface design and the overall art direction. However, it's doing things that the old console simply couldn't do with its destruction system. It also has impressive 3D models and lighting, which are really impressive at times. It's surprising that they even tried to run this on the old system, given what the game turned out to be in the end, with its incredible destruction system that can actually destroy the entire levels if you really wanted to. I also think that Donkey Kong's new design is fantastic in this game thanks to the various expressions on his face. It isn't perfect, however. I have noticed frame rate drops through, so I can't exactly call it a locked 60 frames per second, even though that's its target. It isn't that surprising though, considering the sheer destructibility on display here. You can completely level entire stages in this game as mentioned, but I presume because of that there's a lot of CPU stress happening at the same time, which is why it couldn't be done on the Switch 1 in the end. A late addition to this review is Star Fox. The game is a remake of the 64 original, and like that game, this new version impresses graphically, from the geometric detail on the character models to the lighting, which in some stages can look very intricate. Corneria now actually resembles a city instead of a few abstract rectangular buildings with some roads and bridges here and there that you'd see in the original release. The game seems to run at a 1080p resolution, which surprised me because it doesn't look it. I'd have guessed a higher resolution like 1200p or so, but Digital Foundry have confirmed the resolution. It's similar to Donkey Kong Bonanza, in which it is hitting 1080p but somehow looking sharper than that resolution, at least to my eye. I'm not sure why that is, because on my gaming PC 1080p can generally look unsightly, but not so much on the Switch 2's first party games. Perhaps art direction is doing major heavy lifting here then. We also have a rock solid 60 frames per second with little to no drops, so it's an overall solid package in terms of graphics and performance, and a decent little showcase title for the Switch 2. First party games look great overall then, but I wouldn't be surprised to see the next 3D Mario or Zelda be a cut above all of them graphically. It's the third party games that actually showcase the system better, surprisingly, and what it's capable of. I just want to briefly mention Cyberpunk 2077. I don't own the game on Switch 2, but you can see enough videos of this version in action on YouTube, and I think it's absolutely insane that a handheld can pull off this kind of graphical fidelity, and at around 10 to 20 watts no less, while matching the faster consoles in some key areas. If I didn't have the game on PC already, I'd definitely buy it here, along with some sort of enhanced Witcher 3 edition too. I tried out some Switch 2 demos, and the first up was Team Sonic Racing. Unfortunately, despite having the Switch 2 banner on the store, the demo was actually the Switch 1 version, but based on videos, it is a big upgrade that puts it more in line with the faster consoles, graphically. Next was Star Wars Outlaws, and this demo may have sold me on the game itself, so I recommend you give it a try if you got the system. Graphically, this is obviously wild to see on a handheld, and an excellent title to show off the system's capabilities. The demo had a good bit of macro detailing going on, as well as stunning lighting, and probably the most in-depth photo mode I've seen, which showcases the day and night lighting off well. However, one element I was distracted by was the hair rendering. It looks pretty bad, and it's an issue across the first few Switch 2 titles I've seen. It seems to stem from the low resolution outputs that are then being upscaled to non-native. The game certainly has a soft look to it, and according to Digital Foundry, its native res is actually 720p, which is then upscaled to 1440p, which sounds good on paper, but to my eye this looks closer to 1080p, if not lower even. With that said, I wouldn't mind playing this game on Switch 2, it's a technical achievement for the system. It apparently uses some form of ray tracing too, which is even more crazy, and to top it off, the game's demo ran well enough, sticking to the 30 frames per second target for the most part. It's a really impressive demo overall. After Star Wars, I gave the Final Fantasy VII Remake demo a go. It's a game I've played through on the PS5, and I was pretty impressed with how this looks as well, because this is how I remember the game looking on the PS5. Maybe the Switch 2 version is a bit softer in terms of resolution, but it looked good enough, and the frame rate was a solid 30 frames per second from what I played. The sequel Rebirth came out recently, and it looks to be even more impressive in some ways than this first game, as that one is more of an open world game, and yet based on videos it actually looks like the same game I'm playing currently on my PS5. Sure, some graphics are cut here and there, but nothing that actually affects the enjoyment of the game. It's a crazy achievement so far with these demos, and I recommend you try them out.
Let's go.
Trying out the Resident Evil Requiem demo had me kinda stunned at the job Capcom have done here. I played through this game on my PC maxed out with ray tracing at 1440p at high frame rates, but the Switch 2 version here is a perfectly viable way to play the game. Sure, it doesn't have the high resolution that the other more powerful consoles have, and some graphical settings have obviously been lowered, but the actual art has been fully retained here, which is very important. They could have even pushed it further with an optional 30 frames per second mode with higher graphical settings if they wanted to, as the game runs its frame rate unlocked. Depending on the scene, they can go from 45 frames per second to 60, so it's really impressive overall. So of course it's no surprise that the other Capcom game, Street Fighter 6, impresses just as much, and as far as I know this one has graphical settings closer to the Series S version, but actually has a sharper image on top compared to that version. I'll be curious to see future Capcom titles and even past ones like the announced Resident Evil 2 remake running on the Switch 2, or something like Monster Hunter World even, if they ever bring it over. There are other games that recently came out like Indiana Jones, a game that has ray tracing lighting embedded in its graphical settings. But it does seem like this system will be more viable for buying third-party games compared to its predecessor, and not have a completely mangled experience as was common on that system. I should also mention that Nintendo Online has added benefits if you play the service on the Switch 2. The first and obvious is access to the GameCube app. Now, I'm not a huge fan of subscription-based services for games and would prefer a virtual console way of acquiring them, but I have to admit that Nintendo has done a good job here in terms of how quickly you can get in and out of different games seamlessly and fast. It's no different for GameCube games either, which is really impressive. These games run fine on Switch 2 and in some cases even have better performance than the original system, which is a nice bonus. The image quality is improved too, running at a HD resolution, although not 1440p or 4K, but still sharp enough to my eye. There's also a CRT filter you can enable too, which I like. I'm very picky about CRT filters in general, so I'm surprised I like the one Nintendo chose here. Just for fun, I also added in a comparison with the Dolphin emulator at 4K resolution, as well as my OSSE upscaler running the original PAL release. As you can see, although I like the authenticity of playing on original hardware, playing these games on Nintendo Online isn't a bad way either. I think Nintendo made the right choice in not simply rendering these games at a much higher resolution like Sony did with the PS1 classics on PS5. Sometimes it's better to not see the seams that hold these games together. Still, I think an option would be nice. Wind Waker in 4K and Dolphin emulator is incredible, and we've already seen with Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2, some games simply do look insane at those high resolutions regardless, thanks to timeless art direction. You also get added benefits to the other console apps here if you're playing on Switch 2, such as an improved CRT filter on the other console apps, and the ability to rewind N64 games, which the Switch 1 couldn't do. Also, the latency issues that plagued the GameCube app's launch seem to have been reduced as time has gone on, which is nice. If there's any issue I have with the GameCube app, it's that once again Nintendo is trickling out games at a snail's pace. I can understand that licensing issues have to be resolved, but more effort has been put into releasing an entire new console app with the Virtual Boy along with its own accessory than there has been to release more than one GameCube game in that time, and the game chosen was a sequel on top of it. It just doesn't quite make sense to me why it's been trickled out like this. Other improvements I'd like to see is the ability to play online with random people. The idea of being able to play retro games online with other people has always been this sort of holy grail for emulators, but many of them either have too much lag or too many steps to set up. Nintendo Online has an opportunity to really push boundaries here that I'd like to see. Also, original manuals would be nice too, and the ability to remove the stupid borders around each game that surely can't be good for OLED displays. But even then, it just looks stupid to me, so options will be nice here. It's a service that will continue to improve as time goes on. I'll also be interested in if new consoles are added too, like maybe Sega Saturn or Dreamcast. It's an overall good service and I recommend playing the games on it. So the overall experience of the Switch 2 is very positive then. From the software side of things, I'm looking forward to what Nintendo pulls off with future titles like a new 3D Mario or Zelda, given what they achieved on the Switch 1. But also bearing in mind that the Switch 1 was not that much more powerful than the Xbox 360 or PS3. When you think about it, the company has been on that level of graphical fidelity since the Wii U, all the way back in 2012. So it's actually exciting to think about what they'll do with a next generation leap in graphics that the Switch 2 offers compared to its predecessor. Whether the hardware is worth buying right now will be up to each person. I have a Switch 1 backlog with many games, so being able to play them at their best on the new hardware is worth it for me. And the current Switch 2 exclusives have been impressive so far, so I'm happy I got mine. But this is a 450 to €500 system too. It isn't cheap, and so you should do research on whether or not you actually need or want one right now, as well as weigh up potential price increases later on in the year next due to the RAM supply issues. Anyway, I hope you'll come back in 2032 when I give my thoughts on the Switch 3. Thanks for watching.